This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.
In our last class together, as we studied the intertestamental period, we had an opportunity to talk about Carthage in some detail and the great threat that Carthage posed to the Roman Empire. As we studied Daniel 2 and Daniel 7, we noticed specifically that Daniel had prophesied 4 world empires. These empires would be leading to the fullness of time in which God would send a son, Galatians 4:4, and set up His kingdom, Daniel 2, verses 44 and 45. This threat that was the Carthaginians was fully realized at the Battle of Carthage. In our last class together, we discussed the figures regarding the armies and the losses in those armies in that battle. While some historians may differ as far as whether a greater number or lesser number was lost, all historians will testify to the great victory that was achieved by Hannibal at the Battle of Cannae. Hannibal had won that victory handily in 216 BC. Those statements that we noticed in our last study together, which led up to the actual going to war, the encouragement that Aemilius gave his soldiers, the encouragement that Hannibal gave his soldiers, both sets indicated that if Carthage won, Rome would effectively be no more. In fact, in theory, if Carthage won, then Rome's greatest military leaders would have been silenced. He defeated 2 of her greatest generals at Cannae. Moreover, if Carthage had taken Rome, or so desired to take Rome, there would have been no problem from a supply standpoint, because Cannae was a location where provisions from the area of Canisium were kept. Moreover, it was near the coast, not far from the coast, so it could easily receive provisions from Carthage, which was a naval power, a very great trading power as well in the Mediterranean Sea. Moreover, you had the hatred of Hannibal, which certainly would seem to drive him to want to go into and to run down, so to speak, Rome. In fact, he had indicated that he wanted to do that very thing, and had since he was but 9 years old. Polybius says in Book 3, section 118, "The Carthaginians even found themselves in a position to anticipate capturing Rome itself in short order. And for the Romans, that defeat meant that they immediately gave up any hope of retaining supremacy in Italy, and brought them to the point where they were at serious risk of losing their lives and the very soil of their homeland, and where they fearfully expected to do so, since they anticipated Hannibal's arrival at any moment." Hannibal was literally at the gate. Remember that we mentioned that the satirist Juvenal said around AD 100 that was still used to scare children in his day. That whole Carthaginian myth, that strength of Carthage, which could have and should have rolled over Rome immediately. With this victory, Carthage had the upper hand. Rome had lost the might of its army and was ripe for the coming of Hannibal. The historian Livy simply says, Hannibal did not follow up his victory. Book 22, section 50. Though the eventual victors, Rome, came nearer to destruction than their adversaries, Carthage. Again, Livy, Book 21, section 1. Ultimately, Hannibal waited in the environs of Rome for the better part of a decade and a half, but never attacked Rome. And that is absolutely amazing. And it fits perfectly in with Scripture, because God would not allow Hannibal to attack Rome. That would have violated prophecy. What happened to keep Rome from falling to Hannibal is a matter of debate by historians. Some will argue that Hannibal could not receive provisions, but remember that he controlled Rome's store cities and the eastern coast, and for that matter, most of the Mediterranean. Others will say that Hannibal did not have enough men to attack Rome. But Rome's forces were decimated, and his were capable, because again he's on the coast, of being reinforced. Moreover, we're going to notice in a few minutes a quote from Polybius that says that many Romans were actually going to Hannibal's cause. Hannibal easily could have had more soldiers. What kept Hannibal from Rome, as we mentioned, was God. There was no room in the prophecies of Daniel 2 and 7 for this fifth empire. In 202 BC, a Roman commander, Scipio Africanus, took the battle back into Africa. He threatened Carthage's neighbor and ally, part of the Carthaginian Empire. He threatened Zama. This caused Hannibal to return from his long and ultimately unfruitful Italian expedition. Rome defeated Carthage on Carthage's own ground, and ultimately Hannibal was exiled. For Juvenal, we'll think about Juvenal Satire 10, sections 148 through, or lines 148 through 168, and we can remember the fear that was demonstrated. But specifically, in Juvenal's satires, he said this: "Put Hannibal in the scales. How many pounds will that peerless general mark up today? This is the man for whom Africa was too small a continent." He says, "Spain swells his empire, the Pyrenees, high Alpine passes, but he splits the very rocks asunder, moves mountains." Going down a little bit further, "We have accomplished nothing," he cries, "till we have stormed the gates of Rome, till our Carthaginian standard is set in the city's heart." We could read more of lines 148 to 168, but this fear was extremely strong, and the failure, ultimately, of Hannibal, well noted by this satirist. In fact, the satirist asked at the beginning, "How many pounds will that peerless general mark up today?" But then he would say, "No sword, no spear, no battle-flung stone was to snuff the fiery spirit." Well, he had killed many and had not been defeated outside of Rome. Daniel remained on point. Daniel had said that Rome would be the fourth and final empire of his prophecies, and Daniel was proven accurate. Rome's Punic Wars against Carthage were but a chapter in the great kingdom's history, a dangerous chapter, but just a chapter nonetheless. Before we move on talking about Rome and getting into those folk that we recognize popularly as the Caesars, let's consider some of the historians, particularly two, that we've noticed in good detail over the last couple of classes. First of all, let's consider the historian Polybius. Polybius was actually a Greek historian. He focused, however, on the history of Rome. Specifically, he focused on a time period that was just under 53 years. Polybius had been born into a political family in a city called Megalopolis. Megalopolis meant great city. This city was located in the Peloponnesus of Greece, just northwest of the famed city Sparta. This future historian, Polybius, gained a position while he was in Rome. He actually ended up in Rome because he was a member of a force which Rome did not trust, and so he was taken hostage for a time. But he ended up in Rome serving as a tutor. In fact, he tutored a young man named Scipio Aemilianus. This Scipio Aemilianus is the Scipio Africanus that we noticed a few moments ago. He was able to travel with this former pupil across the Alps, through Spain, and beyond what is now the Strait of Gibraltar, through North Africa, to Zama, and then to Carthage. He was able to see the defeat of this Carthaginian Empire, which fell in 202 BC. When he began writing, he wrote what we know today as the Histories. There were 10 books, and we have roughly a third of those 10 extant. Among other things that he said regarding this time period and his purpose of writing was he mentioned this specific bit of time that concerned him. He wanted to write, he wrote in Book 1, Section 1, how and thanks to what kind of political system almost all the entire known world was conquered and brought under a single empire, the empire of the Romans, in less than 53 years. 219 to 167 BC are the years that he's speaking of. In other words, his purpose was effectively to demonstrate how it was that the Romans had progressed after this narrow call to the Carthaginians. Something interesting that he wrote was actually the purpose of history in his eyes. He was interested in history due to its educational purposes. In fact, he saw 3 benefits from history. First, there is no better corrective of human behavior than knowledge of past events. Sometimes we hear the expression, unless you know the history, you're doomed to repeat it. Second, he wrote, there is no more authentic way to prepare and train oneself for political life than studying history. Now that's an interesting statement because much of what Polybius wrote was foundational to the government of the United States of America. Third, he wrote, there is no more comprehensible and comprehensive teacher of the ability to endure with courage the vicissitude of fortunes than a record of others' catastrophes. In other words, when we see where others failed, we can gain lessons from them so that we don't repeat those mistakes. Now, especially with reference to what we've been studying, these 2 quotes help to sum up how close Rome came to failing and completely being destroyed by Carthage. He writes in Book 5, Section 111, that there was a massive defection to the Carthaginians. That answers the question that some have raised over whether Hannibal failed because he couldn't maintain his army. That's not even a possibility. But then he also said, and this is perhaps more telling, this is from Book 1, Section 3, that once the Romans had defeated the Carthaginians in the Hannibalic War, they came to think that they had completed the largest and most difficult part of the project of worldwide dominion. Imagine what he's saying there. The only real obstacle to Rome's being that 4th empire was Carthage. Not another obstacle measured up. Having defeated Carthage, they felt like they would be indeed kings of the world, and they were, just as Daniel had prophesied. Let's consider another one of the historians that we've been studying. We have read a lot from Juvenal, and each time we've read, we've called that which he wrote a satire, and we've given a number to those satires. His name was Decimus Junius Juvenalis. We call him simply Juvenal. He was born around AD 55 to 60. and died sometime after AD 138, probably around Aquinum, which is near modern Monte Cassino in Italy. So he was a Roman. He wrote satires. 16 we still have. We don't know exactly how many he may have written in his lifetime. Now, what's important about Juvenal from a Bible standpoint is that he was a Roman and a pagan. He was not Jewish, and he certainly wasn't Christian. And we know these things for sure because when he spoke about the Jewish law, he did so unfavorably. Satire 10, verses 100 through 106. In fact, he would satirize that old tome of Moses. Just a big book is what he was saying. He referred to Jewish shortcomings. Satire 3, line 15. And he referred to Jewish stereotypes, some stereotypes which exist to this day. For instance, that Jews are miserly. That was something which Juvenal helped to propagate. Satire 6, lines 159 through 161, and Satire 6, lines 542 to 548. And he also spoke of the burning of Rome by Nero in such terms as to allege that Christians were actually the ones responsible. Satire 8, lines 232 through 239, and Satire 1, line 155. He would speak of Christians as those who burned in shirts of pitch, a reference to Nero's having the Christians drenched in oil and set ablaze. Juvenal had no love lost for the Jews or Christians. That makes what he has to say against the empire of his day and for morality about which we read in Scripture that much more compelling. And he actually has become one of my favorite sources. He wrote about a number of important historical figures that we read about in Scripture, verifying that what we see there is indeed accurate. He wrote about Hannibal, as we noticed in lines 148 through 168 of Satire 10. He wrote about Alexander. We studied Alexander in one of our previous classes, even made reference to Juvenal's statement that a grave in Babylon, a brick-walled coffin, was enough to hold this Alexander for whom the world wasn't big enough. Satire 10, lines 169 through 174. He also made reference to Xerxes and Xerxes' famed whipping of the Hellespont in Satire 10, lines 174 through 188. In his satires, he not only spoke of specific historical characters, he often was condemning of his own Rome. In fact, he condemned Roman excess. He condemned Roman immorality. These types of condemnations were seen in Satire 6, lines 290 through 293, and Satire 2, lines 121 through 129. In Satire 2, lines 160 through 170, Juvenal would go on to say that even among the dead, Rome stands dishonored. This great city was so wicked that it had no honor in the eyes of those who had died. He wrote about the danger of a guilty conscience. Satire 13, lines 192 through 197 and 209 through 235. He showed no respect for the religions of his day. Satire 2, lines 147 through 151, and Satire 15, lines 1 through 13. Even the Roman religions he held in disdain. Satire 6, lines 558 through 560, and 549 through 558. What's also interesting is that he makes reference to a Greek version of the flood. Satire 1, lines 84 through 86. When we read about the Noahic flood, we read what Scripture has to say, and then we can look to the world around us and histories of different nations and mythologies of different nations, and virtually all culture has had a reference to this event. So did Juvenal in his satires. Juvenal also provides a picture of the relationship between Berenice and Agrippa, which we see in Acts 25:23. In Satire 6, lines 156 through 161, he deals with that relationship. In our modern culture, especially here in the United States, we have a culture war of sorts going on. Sometimes we hear reference to a Judeo-Christian ethic, and we hear that attacked as if that could only have come from the Bible and therefore needs to be wholly rejected. Juvenal shows us that Judeo-Christian ethic doesn't have to come from Scripture. In fact, he indicates that Judeo-Christian ethic simply can come from experience, as nature bears out the morality which is seen in Scripture. For instance, he would condemn the Emperor Domitian because Domitian committed incestuous adultery with his niece and then had that niece abort her offspring. That was in Satire 2, lines 32 through 37. In our nation today, typical satirists probably wouldn't want to address such topic without being labeled many number of terms, which wouldn't be kind and would almost make him sound like a bigoted Bible believer. But not only did he condemn Domitian, he condemned the Emperor Otho. Otho reigned for part of AD 69. But he said that Otho would peek in his mirror to see how his armor looked before going into battle. A reference to the effeminacy and likely homosexuality as well of that Roman emperor. That was Satire 2, lines 99 through 101. He also condemned the Emperor Nero. He condemned him as a murderer. Satire 8, lines 212 through 230 and 180 and 189. He would call out whoever it was whom he saw as morally repulsive. With that in mind, let's note that he even condemned those who were homosexual. Not because he was a Jew, he wasn't. Not because he was a Christian, he wasn't. But because nature did not demonstrate that was a reasonable, viable lifestyle. In Satire 2, lines 134 through 144, he would speak of those who would say, I'm going to see so-and-so be married to so-and-so, two men. He said such will be done and done in public soon. He mentioned that these brides, these male brides, would yearn to have their names in the daily gazettes. But then now, quoting from Juvenal, he said, but they still have one big problem of a painful kind. They can't keep their marriage solvent by producing babies. Then he said, nature knows best. Their desires have no physical issue. That sounds a bit like Romans 1, 26 and 27. For this cause God gave them up unto vile affections. For their women did change the natural use into that which was against nature, and likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men working with men that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was meet. In writing his satires, Juvenal was providing a commentary on the immorality and the excesses of Roman society, which could equally be applied to the world today. Let's return to our study of Rome and Rome's early history. We've just finished considering the Punic Wars, that one chapter that is so vitally important when we consider Daniel 2 and Daniel 7. We referred briefly to earlier chapters in her history, which consisted of her growth from village into city under a succession of kings until around 509 BC. That's when we mentioned Rome became a republic, which wouldn't give way to empire for the better part of half a millennium, according to Livy, Book 1, Section 59. This Rome, for a good while, had a history and peace of a free nation, governed by annually elected officers of state and subject not to the caprice of individual men, but to the overriding authority of law. Again, Livy, Book 2, Section 1. This Rome continued to grow. It grew in spite of the fact that there were attacks from outside. She was attacked by the Gauls in 390 BC. If we turn to our map, we get an idea of where Gaul lay in reference to Rome. Gaul was to the west and posed a great threat for a time upon the Roman Empire. But not only did she face the attacks of Gaul for a time, she faced other attacks from Germanic tribes and from different tribes from the east and so forth. But she managed to stave off all attacks, probably the worst one besides the aforementioned Carthaginian threat being that earlier threat from the Gauls. In fact, that threat was so great that Rome itself had been taken except for the Capitol, the building upon Capitoline Hill. That stood firm, was besieged for a time, but finally the Gauls lost heart to actually destroy Rome altogether. Rome was able to pay the Gauls to leave, and they left, and Rome survived. This was still 300 years, 200 years maybe, before the threat that would be Carthage. Over time, central Italy was incorporated into Rome, 290 BC. Sicily was incorporated in 241 BC. Spain, as Hannibal was being chased into Africa, was incorporated into Rome in 206 BC. Macedonia in 168 BC. Greece in 146 BC. And as we've mentioned, Rome under the general Pompey went into Syria in 64 BC. From Syria, Rome went into Judea or Palestine in 63 BC. Rome would go the other direction into that Gaul, which had been such a great threat half a millennium earlier, in 49 BC. The Roman general Pompey was the one who entered into the land of the Jews. Tacitus records regarding his entry, Cneius Pompeius, Pompey, was the first of our countrymen to subdue the Jews. Availing himself of the right of conquest, he entered the temple. Thus it became commonly known that the place stood empty, with no similitude of gods within, and that the shrine had nothing to reveal. The walls of Jerusalem were destroyed. The temple was left standing. So Pompey entered into the Holy Land. Now we mentioned in our last few classes together, especially as we were studying Antiochus IV Epiphanes, about what was called the abomination of desolation. Now that's referred to in Matthew chapter 24. Daniel spoke of it, Jesus says. It's also referred to in Daniel chapters 8 and 11, if I remember correctly. This abomination that maketh desolate of Antiochus Epiphanes was Antiochus going into the temple, causing swine to be offered on that altar, and then causing the swine to be offered throughout the land. Pompey did similar when he entered into the land. So to some degree, he can be considered one who did effectively the same thing as far as the religion of God was concerned that Antiochus IV Epiphanes had done. We're going to consider more about Pompey in our next class together.
World Video Bible School has additional Bible-based resources, including hundreds of video programs on various topics that are available free online or for purchasing on DVD. These programs, along with other print and audio materials, are available at WVBS.org.